Welcome to the World This Week, in which Consortium News looks at global events of the past 7 days. I'm Joe Loria, the editor-in-chief of Consortium News. This week, Iran, a U.S.-Israel split on hitting energy targets. Trump seesaws between pulling out or sending in ground troops, while calling NATO cowards. Plus Tulsi Gabbard and what the intel says. On the show this week are Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst and briefer of presidents, and Patrick Lawrence, former Asia editor of the International Herald Tribune, author and columnist. Once again, this week we're consumed by the historic aggression against Iran, which is celebrating both the end of Ramadan and Nowruz, their New Year's, the beginning of spring, normally the most joyous time of the year. Patrick and Ray, welcome to the program. Before we talk about Iran, which will be the entire rest of the show, I really would be remiss if I didn't ask both of you, who did such great work exposing the Russiagate fraud, about the death of Robert Mueller, who the Russiagate devotees put all their hopes on, that he would prove that Russia had stolen the election for Donald Trump. And by the way, just to make it clear again, exposing Russiagate as the interference of U.S. intelligence agencies in the domestic affairs, the politics, the election, a presidential election, is what Russiagate was about, not a defense of Donald Trump. Ray, give us a few thoughts about Robert Mueller, who died today at the age of 81.
Well, Joe, it's important to state at the outset that this was not just some little caper. It turned the whole American populace against Russia. It made Putin a devil, and it made it impossible for Trump to do anything that he may have wished to do in terms of improving relations with Russia. Now, Mueller himself, you're not supposed to say anything bad about the dead. So maybe I'll go ahead here. Well, he was a Marine first and foremost, and they follow orders, and he became a lawyer, and he still followed orders. The law forgot about it. He was involved in all kinds of shady stuff up there in New England and elsewhere. Anyhow, he made himself quite a reputation as being somebody who could look really decent and do really good things for the system. Now, I'll give you one personal vignette. After he stopped being director of the FBI, and John Brennan from the CIA had just stopped being director of the CIA, he had a big convention of CIA alumni, the last convention to which I've been invited. And John Brennan, with a great flourish, introduced this wonderful Bob Mueller, and Bob Mueller gave a couple of words, to start things off. And they said, I'm happy to take questions. First, yes, what is it? I'm Ray McGovern. I was just wondering from a lawyerly or from a judicial point of view, whether you have any qualms about this process called reconstruction or parallel reconstruction. And he said, what's that? I said, well, for those who don't realize, it's about when you illegally collect information and give it to the police, and then they make an arrest, and then they don't tell the judge, and then they don't tell the lawyers. They just go ahead and crucify this guy. You know what I'm talking about. He looks down at me and says, well, Mr. McGovern, here's the answer. After 9/11, we were given special authorities. Next question. There you go, folks. After 9/11, we were given special authorities. And he let himself be used by these other smart lawyers to conduct this investigation. I guess to his credit, he was not able to do what they really wanted him to do and say that there was this sinister nexus between Trump and the Russians. He couldn't come up with the evidence. There were enough people who knew if he were to manufacture that evidence. So in a way, he punted. And in a way, it was very clear that he sort of was on his out, sort of missing his composure, because at the final thing where they set him up to testify before Congress, he couldn't do it. He couldn't remember basic things. And it was really, really sad, actually. If you could feel sad for that kind of person. So that's my take on Mueller. He was very typical of many of the FBI lawyers who come from the Marines, from the JAG, and they do what they're told. They don't pay my attention to the law.
Well, great, thanks. That testimony, I was recalling that as well, and I wasn't sure whether he was acting or whether he was really suffering some kind of advanced dementia. What do you think?
Well, I know what it feels like to get a little old. I've warned people to tell me if they see me exhibiting those symptoms, but he couldn't answer just simple questions right on the record. And so he was clearly being used. And when you're that kind of person, you don't mind being used if it's all for the good and to make sure that this Trump gets his comeuppance and that Hillary Clinton is absolved from any penalties for what she did, which was pretty egregious in the way she used classified information.
Well, Ray, you're as sharp as ever. Patrick, do you have any insights or comments on Robert
I,
Mueller's passing?
I have one, well, two actually. Um, I mean, Mueller oversaw the most atrocious abuses of the judicial system, um, maybe in my lifetime. Let's leave the holder of the record aside. Russiagate was absolutely extraordinary for all the transgressions and subterfuge he oversaw. But I was quite struck when it came to putting his name on the the proceedings. He didn't do it. I mean, he did, but he did not. He stepped back. His special counsel's his office stepped back, if my memory is correct, from finding the sort of evidence, quotation marks, that the liberal media and the Democratic Party had been hoping for, right? That's what struck me. He also wore very nice suits. I couldn't help noticing time and again, right?
Well, as Ray said, we should say nice things about the recently departed. So
Well, that's my
that's
nice
a
thing.
nice thing. But I want to ask you, I want to move on, obviously, to Iran, but I do have to ask about this indictment because I saw a total collapse within the media of the idea of the use of the word alleged. The idea of putting alleged in your reporting is because an indictment is not a conviction, it's an accusation. And it's not evidence
Yeah.
in itself. You need to present real evidence to prove your allegations at a trial. The trial never took place. Mueller never knew that that trial would never take place because these GRU, Russian Defense Intelligence agents named in this indictment, were never coming to the United States to stand trial. So he knew that in advance. You could put pretty much any allegation you want in there. What do you say, Patrick and then Ray, about this indictment and whether it was a purely political stitch up or was there anything in there at all?
It was all performance. It was all theater. It was all spectacle, if you ask me. I remember when those indictments came out. I thank you for reminding me. Right, I thought that's who they're going to indict. People who have absolutely no chance whatsoever of standing in an American courtroom, indict them. I thought it was transparently uh, transparently theatrical, right? There was absolutely nothing to it. They wouldn't dare indict someone on this side of the ocean who would actually have to go into court, because if ever this nonsense uh, went into a courtroom, it would collapse like the house of cards it actually was, right? Yeah, I kind of love those indictments for the silliness of them.
Yeah. In fact, there was an earlier one, the IRA, and they showed up in court and they had to drop the case. Remember, Mueller had to
Oh,
drop
I
the.
do. Yes, that's right.
Is that
Yeah.
Ray? You're going to say that? Sorry if I forget.
Yeah, that
I
took
forget.
the words right out of my mouth. It's not only, it was stupid. I mean, all you had to do was figure they would hire a lawyer, right? And say, okay, and then they had to drop the case because there was no evidence. And of course, there was this Guccifer 2, Guccifer 2. How's that? How bad does that sound, Guccifer 2? Nobody ever found out who Guccifer 2 was, but I think I know. And there are people who pursued this tooth and nail, and they knew, and it wasn't the Russians. Let's just put it this way. So again, I just want to stress that the whole American populace, including some of my best friends, turned against Putin and the Russians in a very vitriolic way because of how they interfered with the 2016 election, which somebody interfered, but it was President Obama. It was all his minions, and that's provable, and we've proved it, and yet it's an uphill fight to get people to understand that, how bad it could possibly have been, kicking out 55 Russian diplomats on his way out, Obama. So, it was all cooked up, and I guess the only thing that can be said for Mueller is what Patrick has already said. He shied away from actually doing what they wanted him to do. And that was, in my view, simply because that evidence would never stand up because
Yeah.
too many people knew what was going on.
You
Maybe one
remind me,
day.
Ray. You remind me, forgive me, Joe. Russiagate had a beginning and a middle, but you remind me, it has not had an end yet. We are still living with that, if you'll excuse the expression. Well, bullshit. We are still living with that monumental, I'll go with the word hoax, right? Yeah,
Yeah. And it just occurs to me now as you speak, Patrick, that a lot of people hate Tulsi Gabbard, but the deep state hates her with a vengeance because she's come out with documentary proof of what they did. And I said this was a conspiracy, and it was. Now, is that part of the reason why she's been marginalized? Well, I don't know, but it's part of the reason why they hate her with a vengeance. So when she took off after the deep state, in very explicit terms, I couldn't believe how explicit she was, naming names and so forth. Well, what happened to that? That petered out several months ago, and it looks like we know who's still in power, and it ain't people like us, that's for sure.
Yeah. So that, Patrick, good point about the end of Robert Mueller's not the end of Russiagate, unfortunately. And
yeah, yeah.
what has happened to Tulsi's investigation, Ray? Very good point. Of course, we're going to talk more about Tulsi in relation to Iran, but I'll just say this: Guccifer one day will meet Lucifer, his maker.
You know,
His
Ray,
maker.
when you mentioned Guccifer, it brought all those times back, right? When you and I were working together to put together various reports, right? Guccifer, right?
Yeah. Well,
Crowd
just
strike.
just let me add that Patrick, as was his wont, looked at the evidence and particularly the technical evidence that our friends in Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, former NSA technical directors, if you will, who said, look, this couldn't be. It couldn't be. And we said that in December of 2015. All right.
Yeah,
So, a year later, the head of CrowdStrike, the cyber firm that Mueller, in his wisdom, or FBI, it was the FBI hired to come in here and look at the hacking, the Russian hacking. Well, it was in December of 2017 that yeah, I had it wrong. It was 2016 before. Now it's 2017, and he testifies that there's no technical evidence that anyone hacked the DNC for those embarrassing emails prejudicial to Hillary Clinton. It was not a hack. It was a copy in the machine into a thumb drive or some other external device. And that's why there was no technical evidence. Now that was clear as available. We said that months before. People still don't realize. So you ask them about the Russians hacking, and 90% of the American people say, "Well, of course, the bad Russians," and that's a heavy guilt burden for people who participated in this charade, including the people who fired Patrick Lawrence for telling the truth, fired him from a long-standing columnist perch. I won't mention it had to do something with the nation or something like that. I forget exactly what it was.
Go ahead and mention it, Ray.
Oh, I think it was, yeah, I think it was the nation.
Very good, very good.
Well, we could spend obviously a whole hour on this and talk about the media's role in this, and I'd be curious to see how they treat the obituaries of.
Yeah,
Well, it'd be
interesting.
slightly different than what you said, probably, Ray, but I don't know. So let's move on to the main topic, which is consuming everyone, Iran. And this is Nowruz and Ramadan. It's just heartbreaking to see what is being done to this country and the people of that country. And I want to. The New York Times played up this split between Israel and the U.S. on whether to hit the oil installations. Trump first tried to. He lied. He said the U.S. didn't know about whether Israel was going to hit the oil installations. Well, as Larry Johnson showed yesterday on the roundtable that you were on, of course, with the judge yesterday, Ray, that the U.S. of course knew about this. There's no question about that. But the question is not that whether they knew it about it or not, but whether they approved it or not. So Trump is saying now that the U.S. said don't do it, and Israel did it anyway. And this makes sense to me because Israel doesn't care whether the Gulf Arabs oil installations go up in flames in retaliation from Iran. They certainly want to destroy Iran's oil industry because Israel wants the entire region in flames. That's their plan from Clean Break, from Yin Yan plan before that, is to destroy their enemies all around them. And whereas Trump needs to keep oil prices down, and I think he's coveting Iran's oil as he did Venezuela's. So, Ray, let me start with you. Was there a split? Is there a split between Israel and the U.S.? And was it over not whether U.S. knew about it or not, but whether Trump tried to stop Netanyahu from hitting the oil installations for the reasons I just said?
Well, they have different objectives, as you just pointed out, Joe. The Israelis want chaos. They want to continue this thing for as long as they can, and as long as they can keep the U.S. involved militarily. Trump doesn't want that. He wants to not lose the midterms. He wants that Strait of Hormuz open, and the last thing he wants is to decimate all the oil and gas fields. So I'm with you. I'm glad you said that because there's a difference between knowing about it and, tracking data and so forth, about it. Whether it was approved, as I said on that program, the Israelis are famous for preferring to ask for forgiveness after the fact rather than permission before the fact. I mean, that's the way they always operate. And
Exactly.
of course, Netanyahu said, "Oh, we're not, yeah, it was our idea, but we're not going to do that again because President Trump said, don't do that again." Right. You believe that, and well,
Yeah.
Yes, Patrick.
I I took the South Pars attack as a, a a very persuasive indication that the Israelis will they what I see in it is the Israelis. Trump, let me back up here. Trump is in freak out over these energy markets, right? And the last thing he wants to do is to worsen what is obviously a very grave predicament he is in by way of the financial markets and the commodity markets. Okay, so along comes Israel, along comes the South Pars operation. and it's known Israel did it. I take that to mean as a measure of Israel's complete indifference to anybody else's objectives other than its own, right? This is the Zionist ideology. They don't give a hoot about anything else other than their Eretz Israel project, right? The subjugation of everybody around them, beginning with the Palestinians. As numerous people have said by now, Palestine and Gaza and the West Bank, that's the beginning of something, not the end. And this is how I read it, right? They don't care about Trump and the oil markets and all that. It's not of interest to them.
Yeah, well, they get
No
their
matter
oil.
what happens in these markets, they are taken care of. And one other point, if I may, right? The assassination of Larijani. I mean, think about that. Why him? Okay. You have to go back a decade, maybe more. The scholars can help there. They assassinate everybody who's willing to negotiate some kind of settlement, diplomatic, political settlement. That's a very dangerous thing for an adversary of Israel to do. It's another case, right? Absolutely, we cannot have negotiations, and I think Trump, he's got, I was thinking about this before we came on air, right? Trump has some serious choices to make, but I'm not sure whatever those choices are makes any difference because the Israelis, the Zionists, are going to plow forward on this. Any sign of any sign of potential breakthrough at the mahogany table, no, off. They'll blow up the mahogany table if they have to. That's how I read the South Pars thing.
So you agree with Ray, and I thank Ray for agreeing with me because a lot of people
Yeah.
pushing back on me for saying that there's a difference between knowing about it and approving it. And I think the Trump tried to stop Israel from hitting the oil installations, and he disobeyed Trump. And this is not a surprise. By the way, Israel gets its oil, doesn't get its oil from the Strait of Hormuz. It gets it
Right.
from pipeline from Turkey, correct? They have their
Turkey,
own
yeah.
gas field as well, which they've developed. I believe they're producing gas off Gaza as well. So, plus, I think the U.S. they can get probably a good deal on U.S. oil or LNG if they need it. So they don't need the Straits of Hormuz. They want chaos, as Ray said.
Yes,
This is their strategy.
just my point. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Now, as far speaking of the Strait of Hormuz, we should. Trump is all over the place on that one too, really ridiculously, like a 12-year-old. He says, "I want Europe to help me. NATO, you got to come and help it open it." They all say no, no, no. Which I want to ask you, Patrick, in a moment about: is this real spying coming from Europe? They said it's not our war. So then, what does Trump say? Well, I didn't really need them anyway. I was just asking to test them to see what their answer would be. He actually said that. And now he's saying, I don't need them. And now he's calling them cowards. So, Patrick, what is going on here? Is Europe really finally the spine that you and I have talked about so many times? You've written many columns about a European independent streak against the U.S. no longer being vassals. Are we actually seeing this right now? Are they staying out of this war because it's not their war? Following the Spanish prime minister,
Yeah,
as you wrote about?
yeah, yeah. Look, Sanchez, uh, Sanchez is, let's say, blessedly lonely, right? He's the only one who is authentically against this war, unless we may want to count the Slovaks and the Hungarians and so forth. But in 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 Western Europe, Sanchez is alone. I would be very careful to interpret the Europeans' reluctance to get drawn into this as anything remotely to do with spine, strategic autonomy, well, all that. No, no. They're 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 gutless people, and within their gutlessness, here is another layer of gutlessness. They they don't want to get involved in this, not out of principle, but they just don't want another mess on their hands, and they're all tied up. They're all preoccupied with Ukraine and so forth, right? But remember, the British case, right? No, well, we're very reluctant about this war, Starmer says. Um, but if I understand correctly, Starmer has now agreed or is about to, forgive me, to let US bombers take off from RAF airfields. So, you know, if they don't want to get into this because they hope it gets done without them having another mess on their hands. But I would say if push came to shove, they would do what they were told, right? That's my take. Don't read too much by way of principle into the West Europeans. Again, with the exception, the admirable exception of Pedro Sanchez, you know. Yeah.
Ray?
Well, I would look at capabilities rather than intentions. Uh, what can the Europeans do? I mean, their militaries are not able to do much. What is it that Trump is asking them to do? Where the US won't do because it's too dangerous? I mean, on the face of it, it's such a, the only thing I object to, Joe, is you're talking about a 12-year-old attitude. Now, I have a 12-year-old granddaughter who objects violently to that because she's much more sensible and she acts much more prudently.
My
It is
apologies.
maybe it's 11-year-old or something, but it's hard to predict what he'll do or what he'll say, and that introduces its own aspect of volatility here. Here I'm Putin or I'm Xi, and I'm trying to think, oh my God, what's this guy gonna do next? What's he gonna do with these damn Marines that he's sending into the area? Oh my God, we didn't think he'd do any of this. I didn't think he'd do any of this precisely because of what's happening now. He did it anyway. So what else will he do anyway? So it's a real flashpoint that I've not seen the like of in my entire professional career, and that goes back decades and decades and decades.
I mean, who's the coward here? Who's the coward here? I just want to ask. He's asking, like you said, what the U.S. has the capability to go in there to the Strait of Hormuz, and they don't want to do it. They want the Europeans to do it. When they refuse, he calls them the cowards. Yes, Patrick.
Yeah, I look, it's a fashionable term, and I don't mean it in the sense many use it, but it seems to me the question here, I've been wondering about it for some time. I think it came up in our previous segments. The question is agency. We say Trump's war, the Times is all about Trump's war. Uh, I wonder how much of these things that come out of the White House are actually Trump's decisions, the Marines. Um, to what extent is that Trump's decision? To what extent does he even know enough to say, okay, now I want 2,500 Marines? I don't think he knows enough to make that decision. And of course, it goes out from there, right? Uh, you know, uh, he's he's plainly an extremely mixed up man, and I question. I'd love, and I'm asking a question, so maybe you guys can answer it. The extent to which Trump actually has agency to do anything other than perform.
Well, let me cite Joe Kent on this. Those two sentences that he crafted together right as he resigned read as follows: I cannot in good conscience support the ongoing war in Iran. Iran posed no imminent threat to our nation, and it is clear that we started this war due to pressure from Israel and its powerful American lobby, end quote.
Hmm.
Okay. Now, if you watch the whole Tucker Carlson interview of Joe Kent a couple of nights ago, you'll see that Joe is not of the deep state. He doesn't understand the deep state. He's a warrior. He had 11 deployments to Iraq. He came up through the ranks because he knows what he's doing and he's smart as hell, right? And so she was picked to head up the National Anti-Terrorist Organization there, the center. So what's the drift here? Look closely at the last half hour of that interview. Joe Kent says, I don't understand everything that's going on here. I don't really understand why people delayed the withdrawal from Syria, which resulted in the killing of my wife. There's a kind of under movement here that pretty much is in control of these things. And so I'll just say that, Patrick, you said that last time. We didn't discuss it enough. You're quite right. And I think part of that deep state, or whatever you want to call it, I had made a note here. Yeah, Kent calls it the not only the lobbying campaign, but the misinformation, education, the whole nine yards, where the people in charge of our media and these deep state people who raise the possibility perhaps of sending in the Marines, right? That may not be Trump. Now, I don't know how to really gauge that, but I don't know which is worse. All I do know, pardon my late winter cold here, all I do know is that Kent is not able to understand this and is really worried about it and introduces all kinds of things like Charlie Kirk and other things in a very substantive, non-conspiratorial way to say, look, I fell in with these guys through a separate channel. Now I don't understand why things happen the way they do. Nowhere have I seen such palpable evidence from a very top official that he's learned things that he didn't know as a simple soldier.
Well, as you say, Ray and Patrick, it's not Trump's war. It's Netanyahu's war. The New York Times can say whatever they want. And that's what Clark, not Superman. You called him Superman on the show yesterday. Not
Clark
the other Joe Clark, not Ken. Joe Ken, not.
Well, I talk about Hexeth and his Dick Tracy chin, but nobody remembers Dick Tracy.
Oh, goodness gracious. We all do here. That just shows you how old we are. Um, what about the issue of, by the way, the Europeans may not be going in there, but Zelensky's to the rescue. He's sending teams to the UAE, I believe, to try to stop the. So that's the war's over. Israel will win because Ukraine is going to win it for them. Isn't it kind
The
of interesting
German,
that Ukraine is part of this nexus with Israel, and the United States, the most reactionary, right-wing, awful forces on the earth right now? It's not surprising.
Well, I had heard before, and I can't say I can't verify this, but I've heard numerous times that Mossad has been active on the ground in Ukraine, along with MI6 and the agency, right? But the Zelensky bit, let us show you our drone technology. I've watched it over the last few days. I think Zelensky wants to do anything he can to portray himself and Ukraine as kind of a major player, right? We have an advantage here, right? Drone technology, a bit pitiful if you, well, it's a bit pitiful if a nation is looking to display its advantages, it comes down to these little things that fly in the sky, right? But that's how I read it. It's just so much of so much of what Zelensky and the Ukrainians do is posture, right?
No question. He's off the front page. Ukraine. Nobody's talking about Ukraine anymore. He's got to stick his nose
That's
in it.
another point,
Yeah,
Joe. He wants
yeah.
to be back in the news. And don't, well, you can attempt to try to persuade me that Ukraine's drone technology is somehow superior to to other more developed nations. I could be wrong, but I have a hard time with that one.
So what does Trump do now? He's again, just stay on this theme of his seesawing. He's saying, on the one hand, I think we're going to end the war now, and then now there's ground troops going in. Ray, what is he going to do? Could he possibly send ground troops? If the aim is to change the government, to overthrow the government in Iran, most likely they'd have to put ground troops, which wouldn't probably succeed anyway, and maybe 1 million troops. How many troops would be needed? Would they have to occupy Tehran? What is going on with this ground troop story? Is it really going to happen?
Well, in answer to your introduction there, he said at one point that the war is over when Prime Minister Netanyahu and I decide it's over. That's changed. Prime Minister Netanyahu is not going to decide to finish this thing as long as he can keep Trump hooked. Okay. That's why I go back to Iraq, for God's sake, where I'll say this again. After that misadventure began, and General Brent Scowcroft, who was head of the president's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board at the time under George Bush and Dick Cheney, and so had access to all this information, started saying really weird things like the evidence of Saddam Hussein's ties with Al Qaeda is very, very scant. Okay. But worse still, he says, look, after the war started, the whole reason is that Ariel Sharon, Netanyahu's predecessor as prime minister, has Bush wrapped around his little finger. He has him, quote, mesmerized. Now, to whom did Scowcroft say that? Somebody in the garage of K Street? No, he went to the Financial Times and told them that. And he said, print it and attribute it to me. Wow.
Did he?
Yes, he
Yeah.
did. Yeah. And so this is so out of the ordinary for Scowcroft, a typical machine man of the administration. He was fed up. He knew that Iraq was done largely because of these Israeli generals and high officials who had free access to the Pentagon without even signing in. And it's kind of had these people in the Pentagon showing about this terrible nexus between Saddam Hussein and Al Qaeda and almost getting nuclear weapons. So he had it up to here. Now he was never he was removed from his position as chairman of the president's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board right quick. And as far as I could tell, he has never been able to darken the White House doorstep again. Of course, he's passed on now, but here was a creature of the system who would lie. Well, I'm going to tell one vignette here because it has to do with Bob Perry. I think, Joe, you've probably heard it before, but
Yes.
maybe not you, Patrick. Okay. After Bob finally landed his reputation by all the terrific work he did on Iran-Contra, he's hired by Newsweek. Okay. So Newsweek says, "Oh, Bob, come on, we're going to have a corporate's coming down from New York, and we're going to have a big shindig and a little Herrenabend, man's abend. Can you come?" Bob says, "Sure." So Bob explains that he's sitting there with these very high dignitaries. This guy from Wyoming, his name was Cheney or something, and all kinds of, and this Scowcroft. And as Bob eating his shrimp cocktail, Scowcroft, apropos of nothing, says, my deputy, former deputy Poindexter, is going to go before Congress on Tuesday, and I would advise him to say, we never told Ronald Reagan anything about Iran-Contra. Now, Bob Perry was new to this scene. Reflexively, he dropped his shrimp cocktail fork. It shattered his glass, and without thinking, Bob says, Joe Scowcroft, are you saying that you advise your former deputy to perjure himself? That's how quiet it was for about 30 seconds. And finally, the head of Newsweek Menard, he put his arm around.
Maynard Parker.
Yeah,
Gosh.
yeah, put his arm around Bob and he says, sometimes, Bob, you have to do what's best for the country. And then there was
Oh, Jesus.
gentlemanly laughter. Bob was not long for Newsweek. I think they got rid of him, or he opted out after another couple of months. But so all I was trying to say is this is the Scowcroft would lie about their involvement in Iran-Contra and tell us, and yet he's so pissed off here at how the Israelis got us into a war of aggression, for God's sake, that he went to the Financial Times personally and said, look, here's the story, wrapped around a little finger and mesmerized. Put it in there and source it to me.
Wow. Now, returning to Joe's question, I heard a day or two back that Netanyahu has come out and said this war is going to require ground troops. It's how did he put it? It's going to have a ground troops component. He said that a couple of days ago, unless it was AI to, or something else, right? But that's what he's now saying, apparently, right? Can I say one kind of just fun thing in response to Ray, right? I was at Newsweek for one extremely unhappy year, right? And Maynard Parker fired me, came out from New York to Hong Kong to fire me, and fired me while he was being measured for shirts in his suite at the Mandarin Hotel, right? I then started writing for the Herald Tribune. The Herald Tribune called me to Paris. I was sitting in front of the executive editor's desk. How in hell am I going to tell him about Newsweek? What a mess it was, right? Well, Phil Foisey, Wash Post guy, right? I said, Phil, I think I better try to explain that Newsweek. And he interrupted me and leaned across his desk and said, Patrick, I better tell you something first. As far as I'm concerned, the only successful Newsweek correspondent is an ex-Newsweek correspondent. And that's a measure of Bob's success. He lasted even less than I did, right?
And of Maynard's reputation. Yeah.
Oh, I'm glad Bob lasted that little time because otherwise he may not have founded Consortium News if Newsweek had been a place where he would have stayed. I want to go on to one of the main things I want to talk about is the intelligence issue in the war. But one last question was one thing we should perhaps discuss is a very bizarre situation where not only because of this oil crisis that is consuming Trump, and whether he knew about this was going to happen or not, if the Strait of Hormuz was closed, that had been talked about for decades. They have lifted first oil sanctions against Russia and now sanctions against Iran. It's extraordinary, Ray. What do you think of that?
I can't even figure out how that's going to work.
Well, apparently it's oil that's already been that's on ships that hasn't been delivered yet, and it's been blocked from going to port for 30 days now. Russian oil is going to go on the market, and Iranian oil will go on the market. The whole thing about ripping up the nuclear deal that Trump did mistakenly, Obama's nuclear deal, was to put the sanctions back on Iran, and now they're taking them off.
Well, just for a month, just until things get fixed, Joe, I mean, it's really ridiculous. When I see that Secretary of the Treasury get up and talk, I say, where did Trump get this guy, Brags about devaluing the real in Tehran so that there would be an uprising, and said, "Oh, we that was a good one. That's what we call
economic statecraft."
Yes,
Economic statecraft.
statecraft. My God. So, yeah, I wish it were funny. It's not. I was looking for somebody sensible to maybe bring Trump to his, bring him around and see what he got himself into. But I don't see anyone like that. It's just us, It's just us to put out the word and let people know what's really going on. And so Thanks for inviting me, Joe.
You're quite welcome. So, Ray, we have to ask you now about Tulsi Gabbard. And first, about the intelligence here. You sent me last night a VIP's memo that's consorting. Bob Perry was still with us then, in 2015 published. And it's an extraordinary one in which you're warning against going to war against Iran. This is the first Trump administration. The date was December 21, 2017. In fact, Bob left us just a few weeks after this. Tell us
Yeah.
about that VIP's memo. What did it say? You addressed to Trump.
Well, there were neocons and other people plumbing for war against Iran. And one of their major uh, charges, of course, was that Iran is the most powerful, dangerous supporter of terrorism in the whole world, maybe the universe. Okay. And we have enough people, enough expertise in VIPS, not only to have technical directors from NSA, but we had Larry Johnson, who was in the State Department reviewing the terrorists and publishing the terrorist reports, and he could see, no. Iran ranks 8 or 9 among the most important sponsors of terrorism. So, as is our wont, we said, Larry, would you draft a memo and set people straight, and we'll send it to Trump, and maybe he'll come around. Well, we did, because that's what we always do. We laid out the facts, and Larry had all the facts. And a lot of us others chipped in. So we're proud of that memo, and it was very much in the character of where we are now. Except now we've gone to war on this on one of these reasons, and it was never true. I mean, the Sunnis do the Shia real proud and about overshadowing their terrorism activities by a factor of about 10, believe it or not.
Well, the memo says it starts, "We are concerned by recent strident and stark public statements from key members of your administration," that's the first Trump administration, "that paint Iran in very alarmist terms. The average American, without the benefit of history, could easily be persuaded that Iran poses an imminent threat and that there is no alternative for us but military conflict." That was back in 2017, and that there was no alternative but military conflict. And that's where we've arrived now, this issue of imminent threat. But before we get into that, I think Larry, I like that Larry keeps pointing out, Larry Johnson, that it is a Sunni terrorism problem, not a Shia one. That ISIS, Al Qaeda, and associated groups like that are Sunni, and they're backed by the Gulf Arab states and by the United States. And Joe Kent, in an interview with our friend Scott Horton of antiwar.com, he did an excellent. I only saw a little clip of it, but it was an important one. Scott asked questions I think Tucker Carlson wouldn't, and that is, did the U.S. back these Sunni terrorist groups? And Joe Kent, not Clark Kent, yeah, Joe Kent said. Joe Kent said, when the U.S. overthrew Saddam Hussein, obviously Iran benefited because the Shia came to power. They had the majority in Iraq. And then the Israelis freaked out and said, now you've opened up a complete highway from Iran through Iraq into Syria, where Assad is also friendly to Iran, and into Lebanon to fund it and to arm Hezbollah. So we have to break that highway. And Joe Kent says, therefore, they started to back extremist Sunni groups in Iraq to try to stop this from happening. And then they used those groups to overthrow Assad. And for a long time, because of Russia and because of Hezbollah and Iraqi Shia militia, those were defeated in Syria. For the longest time, Assad won because the Sunni terrorists that were trying to overthrow him, and we know from John Kerry that he said in an elite briefing he gave on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in 2015, he told a group of exiled Syrians in New York, he told them that we saw ISIS moving towards Damascus, putting pressure on Assad, and then Putin came in. So that was an admission by the US that they were at least tacitly supporting ISIS in Syria to try to overthrow Assad. Anyway, eventually they did. We do have an Al Qaeda guy now in charge of Syria. These groups of Iran, the Shia groups, are defensive militia, not terrorists. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the militia in Iraq, the Houthi in Yemen. These are not groups that go and do what ISIS has done to kill civilians just for the hell of it and chopping heads off. But that is, Ray, as the memo pointed out, was the misinterpretation that is given to the American people. That
Joe.
Yes, Patrick.
Yeah, I just add that the people we were supporting were referred to as moderate terrorists.
Right.
So we had
Moderate rebels.
So
That was
it
the
was so
phrase.
transparent. We had the CIA training them on the eastern part of Syria. We had the military training them in the northern part of Syria. And it was very clear what was going on. And it was the Russians that came in. Here's another little factoid that would be illustrative. Putin faced down Obama in 2015 and said, look, we don't like what you guys are doing in Syria. We don't think Bashar al-Assad is the greatest guy in the world, but we're going to come to his aid here. Tomorrow, we're going to send aircraft and other kinds of weaponry, and we don't want to get involved in a war with you. So would you have your Secretary of State, John Kerry, get together with Sergei Lavrov and work it out so you can deconflict this thing and maybe even come to some sort of agreement? And Obama said, well, okay, all right. So they got together. They negotiated, Kerry and Lavrov, 11 months. They finally had a ceasefire, okay? This ceasefire was monitored. That is, it was approved by Putin personally and by Obama personally, okay? And the line was finally agreed on, okay? And what happened? The U.S. Air Force, 6 days later, obliterated, pardon the term, all the Syrian forces, about 150 of them, that were known positions for years, okay? Now, Lavrov was very diplomatic. My friend John Kerry told me that not everything he agreed to was possible because of other forces in Washington. And those other forces were strong enough to go behind Obama personally involved, as I said before, and scotch the whole thing. So I don't, I just want to stress that what Joe Kent said about these sinister forces, these things he doesn't quite understand. Well, it's not just the U.S. Air Force. It's people who told the U.S. Air Force to do that. I don't know who they were, but there's another case history of how these things can be done, not only behind the back of the President of the United States, but in contravention of things that he personally agreed to.
Ray, I was about to say previously, there's a long record of the Americans being quite indifferent to terrorist groups, right? But that might be short of the mark. There's also a record of indicating that America is in the business of creating terrorists and supporting them. You've just taken a pretty good example. One other thing I want to add, maybe to the benefit of our audience, these groups that this charge against Iran, the leading terrorist threat, it's quite hollow, but Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas, it really depends on the definition of a terrorist group for that assertion to have any legs at all, right? Sharmeen Narwani at the Cradle made a very, very good case, quite useful during the early days of the siege of Gaza. Exactly the identity of these groups. Yes, they're armed, right? Thank goodness they are, frankly. But they are very deeply embedded in their societies. Education, healthcare, social services and all the rest of it, that I find it really repellent that they are reduced at the State Department. FTOs, foreign terrorist organizations. I find it really repellent that they are reduced to that. I just wanted to say this for the benefit of our viewers. It's an abominable disservice to not only to these groups. I'm not saying they have angels' wings, but also to the way these societies are structured and work. It's a different civilization. It's a different
Absolutely.
culture.
Netanyahu was fond of saying ISIS is Hamas, Hamas is ISIS, and nothing could be further from the truth. ISIS occupied territory in Syria and Iraq. Hamas fights against an occupation. They are
Right.
resistance to an occupation. Yes,
Yeah, that's what I want to say. It's resistance here. Now,
Mhm.
some of you are not old enough to remember that in 1967, November, the United Nations unanimously approved the Security Council resolution, Israel must withdraw from the occupied territories. Unanimous. U.S., everyone voted for it, okay? That was
242.
19. Pardon?
Resolution 242, I believe.
You got it right, yeah. So 242. Now, that was November 1967. Do the math, okay? They haven't withdrawn from most of these territories. And so, by definition, legal definition, these are resistance forces. Are they authorized to resist? Yes. Now, I was a little a little unsure about whether they're able to resist lawfully with violence. And it took the Japanese representative to a high UN assembly to voice the real legal aspect here, and that is they are authorized under international law to use violence to resist the occupied people. Okay. Now, I don't like violence, but when you compare people who are authorized under international law to resist occupations to run-of-the-mill terrorists funded by MI6, Mossad, and the CIA, that's beyond the pale for me. And the tragedy, of course, is that most American people don't realize that difference. And thanks, Patrick, for making that clearer.
Mm, sure.
Now, the question of imminent, the VIP's memo says that Iran is not an imminent threat. That was 2017. Well, that phrase happened to come up this week with Tulsi Gabbard testifying. Ray, I want your input on Ms. Gabbard's performance and the overall issue of the intelligence surrounding this war of aggression against Iran.
Well, what a disappointment it was. The imminent business, let me just start with what she kind of forgot to include. She gave her prepared testimony, written testimony to the senators, but apparently no one read it except John Ossoff from Georgia, and he grilled her. He said, "Now wait a second. You said in this one paragraph, let's see. Actually, Senator Warner says, look, you said at the bottom of page 6 in your written testimony, which you didn't include when you testified, quote, as a result of Operation Midnight Hammer, that's last June, Iran's nuclear enrichment program was obliterated. There's been no effort to try to rebuild their enrichment capability, period, end quote. And so Warner says, now, why did you not include that in your spoken testimony? Is it because it's not what the president says? Yeah, he says, is it because the president said there was an imminent threat? Well, she danced around that, okay? But there it is. She's saying that it was obliterated, that is, the enrichment facilities, and that there's no, I want to read the words, there's no effort. There's been no effort to try to rebuild their enrichment capability. Okay, so that's exactly the opposite of what Trump, sometimes through his spokeswoman, says. And let me just read what that wonderful lady said, Carolyn Levitt. She pushed back on what Kent said. She said, look, quote, as President Trump has clearly and explicitly stated, he had strong and compelling evidence that Iran was going to attack the United States first, period, end quote. Okay, so let's see that evidence. This is what Senator Ossoff was saying. Well, where is that evidence? Show us how it's an immediate threat. And of course, Tulsi Gabbard said, "Well, that's really for the president to decide." And Ossoff says, "Wait a second. This is the annual threat briefing. You're in charge of this, and you're supposed to be speaking independently as an independent representative of the intelligence community, and you're not going to be able to say that this is a immediate threat. No, no, that's the president has to do that. Okay, that's bad enough, Joe. The other thing is, and this really hurts. Back in 2007, as many of your viewers know, the intelligence community, aware of the debacle on Iraq, in which my former colleagues participated in conjuring up non-existent intelligence to justify a war of aggression against Iraq, it was decided, look, they're going after Iran now. That's clear. Um, Jonathan Cook has a book out on this, and he's just updated it to give all like evidence is that what they intended to do, and somebody with some integrity says we got to stop the neocons from going against Iran before Bush and Cheney leave. They commissioned a national intelligence estimate. They gave a person with integrity the chairmanship, Tom Finger from State Department Intelligence. The main conclusion was, and I quote, Iran stopped working on a nuclear weapon at the end of 2003 and has not resumed work on a nuclear weapon. We say that unanimously, all 16 intelligence agencies, and we say this with high confidence. Whoa, did that prevent a war with Iran? It did. And I can prove it. Just read Bush. Well, don't read them. Get it out of the library and see what Bush said on page whatever. He said, quote, this was an eye stopper. Quote, for how could I authorize a military strike against the facilities of a country that the intelligence community says has no active nuclear weapons program? Bummer. He didn't say bummer, but he says that right on that page. He wasn't written it himself. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that ever since 2007 to 2015, where Tulsi Gabbard said this, quote, the U.S. intelligence threat assessment, we continue to assess Iran is not building a nuclear weapon and that Khamenei has not reauthorized nuclear weapons program that he suspended in 2003. That was 1 year ago, less than a year ago, late March last year. What'd she say this time? Oh, it's really interesting. You have to dig way in, halfway into the uh, assessment, okay? And what she says is this, Zippo. She says, we are monitoring Iranian WMD-related capabilities and actions following the initiation of Operation Epic Fury. So, for the first time since 2007, the intelligence community has punted and not said Iran is not working on a nuclear weapon. The only way it could be an imminent threat, my God, would be to say that it was and it wasn't. And so the whole thing, I have to say that except for that one estimate, which is the only estimate in my long experience that has prevented a war or that has played a huge role in preventing a war, how that estimate was thrust aside this year by Tulsi Gabbard because she didn't want to admit that they're not working on a nuclear weapon. And In the old days, I would say, well, as long as the intelligence community stuck to that gutsy conclusion. Granted, it was the State Department head of intelligence and research that came in to do it, but it's the intelligence community. As long as they stood by that, well, I have a measure of pride in their stick-to-itiveness, okay, and their integrity. That's all vaporized now. There's no reason to say don't throw the baby analysis out with the bathwater, the operatives. There's no reason to say that now. Throw the whole thing out. It's worse than nothing at all.
Why is she doing this, Ray, or Tulsi Gabbard? Why is she behaving this way? I have a theory, but I want to know what you think.
Well,
Me too.
I used to think that, it was a kind of a tough decision whether to criticize her because she just might be able to work some sensible thinking into the administration because she is at that high level. But she's been so marginalized and now she's been so shamelessly malleable, if that's the right word, that I don't really think so. However, I grant you, there is some sort of argument that can be made that when this thing all kind of peters out and the people responsible for telling Trump, yeah, go ahead and do this, or not telling him what will happen when the Strait of Hormuz is closed, okay? When he gets rid of all those, who will be left? Well, Tulsi didn't tell him that. Maybe you should. That's a long shot now. I favor getting rid of her. I favor her quitting. I had thought, interesting, isn't it? That not Clark Kent, but Joe Kent, right? When did he do that? The day before she was going to testify. My guess is that he went to her because, they got together and he said, look, Tulsi, I'm going to have to do this because it's a matter of conscience. You don't hear that word very much in Congress. Okay, is it Congress? Conscience, okay? I suggest you do the same thing. I'm sure that Tulsi had a bad night, but she decided to conform. Joe, I'd be really interested in your theory.
Well, mine is that there's a Republican nomination coming up for 2028. And she ran twice as a Democrat to try to get the nomination. I think she wants the Republican nomination. Probably, of course, Vance and Rubio will be her main opponents, and she doesn't want to alienate Trump. Trump was going to be very important who he backs to be his successor. So I think she doesn't want to alienate Trump, and she'll say anything she can to stay on Trump's good side, which is an absolute disgrace and a failure because her responsibility is to the country, not to her career.
I think that's stupid, actually.
What?
There were high expectations of the Tulsi Gabbard earlier on because of her opposition to wars of adventure and so on and so forth. They were misplaced. I think one reason we're talking about Tulsi Gabbard now is because she's been such a profound disappointment to so many people. As early as her confirmation hearings for DNI, I thought this person is another Maine chancer, right? And that's what she's turned out to be. If she were to run again for president, I'd be completely indifferent to whether she got it or not. She's not going to make any difference in the conduct of the Imperium, none whatsoever. I dismiss her as an unserious person, not and with plenty of company, but she is one. That's my view. I wouldn't expect anything more from her. I don't really care whether she resigns or not. What's the difference?
Yeah.
Well,
yes, it probably wouldn't make any difference, but it save her integrity, of which she has very little, if any. So you mentioned the Imperium, and let's end on this. What does this mean for the American Imperium? What happens in Iran? To me, this is a major historic battle, and if there is a battle over Hormuz, I think they'll be talking about the Battle of Hormuz maybe centuries from now, because this is the U.S. empire running up against the front line, which is Iran, behind which is BRICS, behind which is Russia, China, developing countries trying to resist American world dominance. Is that how you see it? Patrick, that this war is, as one writer in The Guardian put it, this is the America's Boer War, which is
Yeah,
when
I
Britain
like
lost to
that.
the Boers.
Yeah,
That was the end of their empire. I also think it could be like Carthage. There's a fanatical obsession, like people like John McCain, who sang "Bomb, Bomb, 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 Iran," if you remember that to the Beach Boys song, and his sidekick, who is still with us, Lindsey Graham. They're obsessed with destroying
yeah.
Iran the way the Romans were obsessed with destroying Carthage. What do you think about this, Patrick?
I've started collecting these historical comparisons. The Boer War one was kind of interesting for its nuance, right? Carthage, is it is it America's Carthage? Is it America's Gallipoli? Is it America's Suez? Right?
Heard that
Dot
one.
dot dot. Okay. I don't see that we need. They're interesting. We bring the scholars in on this and see what they think. Okay. But for a brief time, I thought this is this is a major confrontation between the West and the non-West, and America is being uh, handed a very big piece of news. I don't know what will happen on the ground or in the air, however we wish to put it, but uh, this is a major setback for the empire. Okay, but I thought, wait, Vietnam was the same damn thing, right? We've been handed this kind of news at least since 1975, maybe April 75. Uh, uh, maybe earlier than that if you want to count various other encounters we've had, right? But we're just in that phase where these people in Washington, I'm not the first to observe this, have no gift for learning anything from the past, even their own experience. And I think it's, you know, the Boer War or Carthage or Gallipoli or Suez. I like Suez actually because the Straits of Hormuz kind of, you know, the Iranians are blocking it the way Nasser blocked the canal, right? Okay, but I, I think this is a major blow, no matter how this turns out on the ground. And I'm not with that Guardian correspondent, columnist, who said, well, in the end, one way or the other, the West is going to win this. That might be so, who knows? But I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. Think about Ho's army, right? What sort of chance would you have given them in the late 50s or early 60s? You know?
Oh, exactly. Patrick?
Right. I've been asking you about that guy, Ray. You need to answer my email.
Yeah, this is James Bradley. Oh, I do. Yeah, James Bradley wrote this. It's about not how we lost, but how the Vietnamese won, and it's a masterpiece.
Yeah.
Okay, first I have to tell you, my Irish grandmother met Queen Victoria in connection with the Boer War. My grandmother was a seamstress with a very rich lady, and she traveled to London and Paris and other places. In 1900, I think it was, her rich lady said, now Jane, the Queen is going to be going out this gate of Hyde Park, and if you get there at noon, you can probably see her. Now, to hear my grandmother tell her, she sat, I put myself right in the corner there. She couldn't miss me. And sure enough, these Japanese fellas all over the horses and really opened the gates, and there she came in her coach, and the window was open, and she looked down at me, and I said, well, how the hell are you? But I don't think she heard me. There's a lesson here. We're going to start saying, how the hell are you, to people like Stormer and all these other people who really are uh, just elevated to positions of which they are not capable. Now, are they
Hmm.
going to do something to Hormuz? No. Are we? Would oh my God, I was going to say would be crazy to, but that doesn't count anymore, okay?
Right.
Now, there have been several military exercises and tabletop and all that kind of stuff. Look at the cliffs themselves. Look at the hidden artillery and other ship anti-ship missiles. It will be a massacre. Now, does Trump want that before the election? Does he want that at all? I don't think so. So that's why he's saying, "Oh, we don't need to turn. Let everybody else. It'll open by itself after a while." So I think we can be spared that. The key thing here is Israel. Let's get back to that. Trump initially said, "Well, Netanyahu and I will decide when this stops." We know now that's going to be more Netanyahu that decides when it stops because I don't think he can be restrained even by Trump. I think he's got a lot on Trump. I think he's got Epstein stuff on Trump that won't quit. And I think Trump feels really hemmed in, not only wrapped around Netanyahu's little finger, not only mesmerized, but scared, scared to death. Okay. So we'll just have to see how it plays out. But I think the world is going to say, look, we can't tolerate the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. There's got to be some way that the Russians and the Chinese and even some of the more sensible Arab states will come to some sort of intermediary role and say, all right, look, you want Trump, you want to get out of this thing. Here's the way we can do it. We have the Russians, we have contacts not only with the Israelis, we have them, of course, with the Iranians. We can help you on this. Just ask us. And in a sense, Trump already did when he called Putin about 3 weeks ago. So I think that's the way it's going to get resolved in an interim kind of way, just because the midterms are coming. I just can't believe that Trump got himself into this situation without knowing what a disaster this would be. And he's got to come to a senses now because gas prices are so high and because everybody in the whole world has him isolated, including his West European friends.
Mm, mm.
Well, then it comes back to the question whether Israel, Netanyahu will obey Trump. If in fact there's some kind of deal and Trump finds a way out, they're going to, with the intervention of the Chinese, perhaps as mediators, and they did mediate between the Iranians and the Saudis before, if you remember, that
Did,
created
yeah.
a lot of hope a couple of years ago.
Mhm.
But what would Netanyahu do? At some point, if the U.S. cuts off the weapons, they'd have to stop. But that will be the big question then. This time, does Netanyahu stop? He might just pivot to Lebanon. There was already an article more than a week ago in Haaretz saying that the Israeli generals are prepared to continue the war in Lebanon and give up on Iran at some point. So maybe that's what would happen. It remains to be seen.
You know, I'm with the Iranians on this. I I I understand entirely and entirely sympathize with their sentiment. We've had enough of ceasefires. The Israelis go away for a while and then they come back. They want some, they want an enduring settlement of this question, and they should have one, right? And I would, frankly, uh, I would hate to see some kind of patched together ceasefire that leaves Iran with the Damoclean sword held by Israel over its head indefinitely. It's time. It's really time, right? And I don't see Netanyahu uh, if if he doesn't succeed in scuttling whatever diplomatic channel Trump may forgive it. I have no faith in Trump's agency. If he doesn't scuttle what diplomatic channel the Americans may open, uh, I, I would be very surprised, right? I would be very surprised.
Yeah, I just say that Netanyahu is the loose cannon here. This is an existential threat not only to Israel, but to Netanyahu. The Israeli Supreme Court, the legal people have said, look, we're not going to allow a pardon, no matter what your friend Trump says. A pardon is off the table. We're going to go to court on this thing. And in the interim, Netanyahu is losing support. His coalition is losing support. The elections are coming at the latest in October. So what will he do? Well, here's a guy who does genocide. Here's a guy who does forced starvation. Here's a guy that will assassinate just about anybody he get his hands on. Do you think do you think that Netanyahu will shy away from using one or two little tactical nuclear weapons? I
Just the
think
question, Ray. Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
I think he probably will. Short of that, we could have a major false flag attack, perhaps even in this country, to make sure that Trump can be persuaded, so to speak, to continue to support Israel. Uh, Whether the Iranians can obliterate Israel is the real fact on the ground that needs to be resolved. I've been given to believe they can. They have enough missiles and they have enough way to get through their missiles. So that's what it might come to. And that really worries me greatly. And that's why I think the Russians, especially, but the Chinese as well, will try to twist Trump's arm and say, look, nobody's going to benefit from this. And just maybe there'll be something short of the worst. And I think the worst would be use of nuclear weapons and or this kind of false flag that would be designed to force Trump's hand by blaming it on the Iranians.
Yeah.
Well, Ray, I'm very frightened by what you say, but I think there's a real scenario where that could happen. It looks like Netanyahu wants total war against Iran, total
That's
destruction
my
of the
point. Right.
country, and Iran can respond to that as long as they can. And you can see Iran is only retaliating. Israel and the U.S. started this, Iran responded. Israel first hit the oil installation, Iran hit the oil installations of Qatar. Today, Israel hit Bashir, I believe, and maybe in Fordo. And what did Iran do today, Saturday? They sent a hypersonic missile to Dimona, and that was confirmed. There's a video. It looks like it's a real one because Times of Israel is reporting it hit a building in Dimona, not anything that would spread radiation, but a warning, it looks like 20 people injured in that building in Israel, in Dimona. Of course, Dimona is where the plutonium is created for Israel's nuclear weapons. The weapons themselves are stored on a base underground west of Jerusalem somewhere. But Dimona is key to the Israeli weapons program, obviously. The Iranians hit it with a hypersonic missile today. As this keeps escalating, that's why, and also from Israel's point of view, they would want to use a nuclear device before Iran builds one, which they might have decided to start doing now. Scott Ritter thinks that have decided to do it now. Who knows? But they want to do it before that. I think, Ray, it's absolutely totally feasible that Netanyahu would order a nuclear strike, a small one, on
Yeah,
Iran. That
tactical.
psychologically would change a lot, wouldn't it, Patrick?
Tactical. I don't know whether it was Lawrence Wilkerson or one of the colonels. I thought the other day was saying, not one, not two. Iran's a big country. They could drop 10, 15, 20 tactical nuclear weapons where the radiation is controlled but devastating nonetheless in its area, And we were talking after hours the last time we got on camera here, you and I, we three actually. Um, and I think the Israelis are itching to use these nuclear weapons, right? They would love to show the world, we will do anything. You better be aware, we will do anything. That's forgive the expression, that's somewhat their trump card, right? Be warned, whatever you do, we will do anything we need to do to advance the Zionist cause. No limits,
It might be to save Israel's existence. That's the question here. If Iran has as many missiles as some people think they do, hypersonics and extra, and they continue to pound Israel, they might find that that's the only way to survive as a state, Israel, is to use those devices.
I'm a great believer in deterrence, right? Um, my view of deterrence is any circumstance that requires deterrence is not a happy situation. But when it's necessary, it is. I hope Iran develops the bomb as quickly as it possibly can, including a warhead that can deliver it. And that's not because I like nuclear weapons, it's because I don't, right? That's my take on these matters.
Ray, if Iran had a bomb right now, do you think Israel would use theirs? That's the question that Patrick's raising.
Yeah, that's a hypothetical. Iran
Hmm.
doesn't have a nuclear weapon now, so it's kind of hard to. If the Israelis learned, and they probably have the capability to learn, that the fatwa has been reversed, that the Supreme Ayatollah, the Supreme Leader Junior, has said, well, that's for the birds. We're going to go ahead. Israelis probably learned it right quick. Question is whether they would choose to preempt or not. Our only hope, in my view, is the Russians, maybe the Gulf states, somebody sensible who has a real deep stake in what happens here could mediate this thing and persuade Trump, look, you know, Netanyahu is afraid not only for Israel's existence, but he doesn't want to end up in jail, for God's sake, okay? And that's going to happen after October, okay? So he's going to do whatever he has to do before October. Let's preempt that. Let's get this thing settled. Let's get this straight open. And for God's sake, let's not use nuclear weapons.
Well, Ray, I don't think the
You,
Russians could intervene because the Ukrainians are there already. They're going to head them off with they're going to head them off
Yeah,
with the pass.
but Ray,
Oh.
you suggest a very interesting timetable that we would do well to pay attention to, but it's the clock ticks between now and October, I suppose you're suggesting.
Yeah, that's what I am suggesting. And as for the Ukrainians, man, their whole navy is going through the Suez Canal right now on the way to open the straits. So that's the latest information breaking, which I just made up. Mhm.
Yeah, exactly. Well, October for Netanyahu, November election for Trump. And we'll have a lot more to talk about before then. Let me thank Patrick Lawrence very much for your contribution and Ray McGovern for your insights, particularly on intelligence matters.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
and
You're
I
welcome,
hope
Joe, and always a pleasure.
and I hope you guys join us again soon. So for our producer, Kathy Vogan, I want to thank her and our audience for watching The World This Week. This is Joe Lauria for Consortium News saying goodbye.
Get out your notebook. There's more.
If you are a consumer of independent news, then the first place you should be going to is Consortium News, and please do try to support them when you can. It doesn't have its articles behind a paywall. It's free for everyone. It's one of the best news sites out there, and it's been in the business of independent journalism and adversarial independent journalism for over 2 decades. I hope that with the public's continuing support of Consortium News, it will continue for a very long time to come. Thank you so much.